Part 1. The beginning of the end. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would betray her husband. I never imagined that the woman I saw in the mirror could be so unrecognizable. But life is strange, isn't it? It twists and turns, and before you know it, you're somewhere you never expected to be. It all started about a year ago. Jake and I had been married for 7 years, long enough for us to be comfortable, but maybe too comfortable. Our days had become predictable. The excitement that once filled our relationship had faded into routine. The morning coffee together, his tired kiss on my cheek before leaving for work, the quick, "How was your day?" exchanges in the evening. We weren't fighting, but we weren't really talking either. We just existed alongside each other, going through the motions. It's cliché, I know, but that's how it felt. He'd spend hours at the office, claiming he was working late to secure that next promotion. I didn't mind it at first. I was proud of his ambition. But as the nights grew longer and his attention drifted away, I began to feel invisible. Like I was no longer part of his world, just a fixture in our home. And then there was him, Michael. It wasn't planned. I didn't wake up one day thinking I'd destroy everything I built with Jake. But Michael, he was different. I met him at work. We started talking about harmless things, office gossip, weekend plans, but there was always something more in his eyes. He'd laugh at my jokes, compliment my ideas during meetings, and he noticed things about me. Things Jake hadn't noticed in years. He saw me. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. He'd linger after a meeting just a little longer than everyone else, ask me to grab a coffee with him during lunch breaks. I could feel the tension growing, like electricity buzzing between us every time our eyes met. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just lonely, that Jake and I were in a rough patch, and it would get better. But the truth was I craved the attention. I craved feeling desired again. And with Michael, it felt effortless. I wasn't just Jake's wife, or Mrs. Harper anymore. I was Emily. Me. Someone who mattered. One evening, after staying late at the office, it happened. We were alone in the break room, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken between us. He was standing too close, his hand brushing against mine as we reached for our coffee cups. It felt like fire under my skin, every touch setting off sparks. And then, without thinking, without even a second of hesitation, I leaned in, and our lips met. It wasn't a soft, gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, like all the pent-up emotions I had been hiding for months suddenly crashed through me. My heart raced as his hands found my waist, pulling me closer. For a split second, I thought about Jake, about what I was doing, about how this could ruin everything, but the moment was too intense, too intoxicating to stop. I didn't want to stop. When we finally pulled away, breathless and flushed, reality hit me like a wave. What had I done? This wasn't just some harmless flirtation anymore. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Desire, guilt, maybe both. "Emily," he whispered, his voice low and almost apologetic. "I'm sorry." I shook my head, stepping back. "No, I wanted this too." My voice trembled. I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. I had wanted this. I had wanted him. We didn't talk much after that. We both knew there was no going back to how things were before. The kiss had changed everything. As I drove home that night, the guilt settled in the pit of my stomach. Jake was waiting for me, like he always did, with a glass of wine and a smile. I kissed him, trying to shake off the memory of Michael's lips still lingering on mine, but it felt hollow. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my entire world was beginning to unravel. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could stop. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Would you like me to continue the story from here?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше.
Чат сказал. Part 2, slipping further. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to focus on Jake, on the life we had built together, but something had shifted inside me. I couldn't shake the memory of Michael's lips, the way his touch made me feel alive again. It was as though a door had been opened, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't close it. At first, I thought I could compartmentalize it. I told myself that the kiss was a mistake, that it didn't have to mean anything. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more it consumed me. The tension between Michael and me at work became unbearable. Every time I saw him, my heart would pound in my chest, my stomach flipping in a mix of excitement and dread. Jake, oblivious as ever, continued with his late nights at the office. He'd come home exhausted, barely saying more than a few words before falling asleep. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that something was wrong, that I was slipping away from him, but every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to admit that I was the one pulling away. But the truth was I was lonely. I had been lonely for a long time, and with Michael, that loneliness faded, even if only for a moment. It wasn't long before Michael and I found ourselves alone again. We had both stayed late after a meeting, working on some last-minute details for a project. The office was quiet, the soft hum of computers the only sound as we sat side by side. I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating, and when our eyes met, I knew it was inevitable. This time, there was no hesitation. He leaned in, and I met him halfway. The kiss was urgent, needy. My hands tangled in his hair as his fingers grazed my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I knew it was wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. I couldn't. We stumbled into the small office next door, our lips never parting as we closed the door behind us. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a desk lamp, casting shadows across his face. His hands were on me, pulling me closer, and I gave in completely. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Jake, not our marriage, not the consequences that were sure to follow. All that mattered was the way Michael made me feel, desired, alive, wanted. We didn't talk about what happened afterward. We straightened our clothes, caught our breath, and walked out of the office like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The guilt gnawed at me, eating away at the edges of my conscience, but at the same time, I felt exhilarated. It was a dangerous feeling, one I knew I shouldn't indulge, but it was addictive. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Michael and I continued our affair in secret, meeting in hidden corners of the office, sneaking away during lunch breaks, always careful not to get caught. I was living a double life, balancing between the version of me that was Jake's wife and the woman who found herself tangled in someone else's arms. At home, Jake noticed the change. "You've been different lately," he said one night, his voice quiet as he watched me from across the kitchen. I was washing dishes, my mind miles away, lost in thoughts of Michael. I froze, my heart racing. "Different?"
How?
I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. Distant, I guess. Are you okay?" The concern in his eyes sent a pang of guilt through me, but I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just busy with work. Things have been stressful." He accepted the lie easily enough, nodding and letting the subject drop. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't blind. He knew something was off, even if he didn't know what it was. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slipping further and further away from Jake. Our conversations grew shorter, more strained. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me. I knew I should end it. I knew I was playing with fire. But every time I told myself it would be the last time, I found myself back in Michael's arms, unable to resist. There was a part of me that wondered how long I could keep this up, how long I could balance the two lives I was living without everything falling apart. I told myself that I could control it, that I could stop whenever I wanted. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was in too deep. Part 3. Cracks in the surface. One Friday night, after Jake had yet another late meeting, I sat in the living room waiting for him to come home. The wine glass in my hand felt too light, the room too quiet. The loneliness crept up on me, thick and suffocating, as the guilt gnawed at my insides. When the front door finally opened, I could tell by the look on Jake's face that something was wrong. His expression was tired, drawn, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He dropped his keys on the table and, without looking at me, said, "We need to talk." My heart stopped. I set down my glass, trying to keep my voice calm. What is it? He took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. Emily, what's going on with you? You've been acting so strange lately. I feel like you're not even here anymore. Like you're somewhere else. Panic surged through me. Did he know? Had he found out? I searched his face for any sign, but all I saw was frustration, hurt. He was trying to understand, trying to reach out, and it only made the guilt that much worse. I'm just stressed, I said, the lie slipping out too easily. Work has been overwhelming. Jake shook his head, pacing the room. This isn't just work, Emily. You've been distant for months. You barely talk to me anymore. I come home, and it's like you're not even here. I felt my throat tighten, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I don't know what to say, Jake. I've just been dealing with a lot. He stopped pacing, his eyes locking on mine. Is there someone else? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling as I tried to keep my composure. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean, but the fear of losing everything, of shattering our life together, was too much. Instead, I shook my head, forcing out a quiet no. Jake's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he didn't believe me. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do, Emily. I feel like I'm losing you. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in months, I felt the full weight of what I was doing. I was losing him. I was losing us. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'm sorry, Jake. I don't want to hurt you. He nodded, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. Then don't. Would you like to continue the story from here?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше.
Chat сказал. Part 4. Spiraling out of control. Jake's words stayed with me long after he went to bed. Then don't. His voice echoed in my mind, mingling with the guilt that was already suffocating me. I stood in the quiet living room, staring out into the darkness, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into an abyss I couldn't escape from. I knew I had to stop. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, lying to Jake, sneaking around with Michael, pretending like I could somehow manage both lives. But the truth was, I didn't know how to stop. Every time I told myself it was over, that I wouldn't see Michael again, I found myself drawn back to him, like a moth to a flame. I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't break. The next morning, Jake was distant. He kissed me on the forehead before heading out the door, but it lacked the warmth it used to have. There was no softness in his touch, no lingering affection. It felt like a goodbye. And maybe, in a way, it was. I had pushed him so far away, I wasn't sure if I could ever bring him back. Michael, on the other hand, was becoming more brazen. He'd send me messages at work, subtle but suggestive, hinting at our next secret rendezvous. Every time my phone buzzed with his name, a rush of adrenaline shot through me, followed by the familiar sting of guilt. But I couldn't resist. His attention, his desire. It filled a void inside me that I didn't know how to fill any other way. We continued to meet in secret, stealing moments when no one was watching. But it wasn't just physical anymore. There was something deeper growing between us, something that scared me. I could feel myself slipping further into this affair, not just as an escape from my marriage, but as something I wanted. Michael made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and that terrified me. One evening, after yet another late night at the office, I met Michael in a hotel just outside the city. It had become our routine, an escape from the prying eyes of colleagues and the guilt that followed me home. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn, casting long shadows across the bed where we lay entangled in each other. As I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, I felt a strange mix of contentment and dread. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't who I was. I was supposed to be a good wife, a loyal partner, someone Jake could trust. But here I was, lying in another man's arms, pretending like this was somehow okay. Michael shifted beside me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my back. "You're quiet tonight," he murmured. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. He sighed, pulling me closer. Emily, we don't have to keep doing this if it's tearing you apart. I care about you, but I don't want to be the reason you're hurting. His words were kind, but they only made the knot in my stomach tighten. It's not just you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's me. It's everything. Michael didn't press further. He never did. In some ways, that made it easier to be with him. There were no expectations, no demands. He wasn't asking for more than I could give. But at the same time, it left me feeling more lost than ever. Because I knew, deep down, that no matter how much I cared for Michael, he wasn't the solution to my problems. He was just a distraction from them. As I drove home that night, the streets empty and silent, I felt a heaviness settle over me. This double life was exhausting. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that someone would find out, that Jake would finally piece together the truth. But it wasn't just the fear of being caught that weighed on me, it was the realization that I was losing myself in the process. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me in the mirror anymore. I had become someone I didn't like, someone who was willing to risk everything for a fleeting sense of excitement and validation. When I walked through the front door, Jake was sitting on the couch, his laptop in his lap, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face. He looked up when I entered, his eyes tired and searching. "You're home late again," he said, his tone flat but not accusatory. I swallowed hard, the life forming on my lips before I could stop it. "Yeah, work was crazy. I lost track of time." He didn't respond, just nodded and turned back to his laptop. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I should say something, apologize, explain anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I quietly slipped into the bedroom, closing the door behind me. Part 5. The Breaking Point. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of my lies began to crush me. Jake's growing distance, his quiet observations, made it clear that he wasn't as oblivious as I had once thought. He knew something was wrong, and I could see it in the way he looked at me, the questions he didn't ask but wanted to. One Saturday, Jake suggested we go out for dinner, something we hadn't done in months. It was a small olive branch, an attempt to reconnect, and part of me wanted to accept it, to hold on to what little was left of our marriage. But when I looked at him, I didn't see the man I had married. I saw the man I was betraying. We sat across from each other at a cozy Italian restaurant, the low hum of conversation and clinking silverware filling the space between us. Jake tried to make small talk, asking about my day, my plans for the week, but every word felt forced, every answer hollow. My mind kept drifting back to Michael, to the tangled mess I had created, and I could see the frustration building in Jake's eyes. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm, "we can't keep pretending like everything is fine." I stared at my plate, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I mean this, us. You've been distant for months, and I don't know why. But I can't keep doing this, wondering where you are, what's going on in your head. I need to know the truth." The truth. It was such a simple word, but it carried the weight of everything I had been avoiding. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at him, the man who had stood by me for years, who had loved me through all the ups and downs. I owed him the truth, but I didn't know if I had the strength to give it to him. My voice cracked, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I've made mistakes, Jake." His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "What kind of mistakes?" I felt the tears welling up, threatening to spill over. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I've been seeing someone else." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake's face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" I couldn't look at him. "A few months." Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his face contorted in pain. "Why, Emily? Why would you do this to us?" The question cut through me like a knife.
Why?
It was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, and I still didn't have an answer. I don't know, I whispered. I was lonely. I felt like we were drifting apart. Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. So, you decided to sleep with someone else? Instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you chose to cheat. I wiped at my eyes, my hands shaking. I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at me with a look of disbelief and devastation. Finally, he stood up, throwing a few bills on the table to cover the check. I need to go, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Jake, please, I started, reaching out to him, but he shook his head. I can't do this right now, Emily. I need time to think. And just like that, he was gone. I sat there in the middle of the restaurant, my heart shattered, knowing that I had just destroyed the only thing that had ever truly mattered to me. Would you like me to continue from here?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше.
Чат сказал. Part 6, The Aftermath. Jake didn't come home that night. I sat in our dark living room, staring at the clock, waiting for the sound of the front door opening, for his footsteps in the hallway. But they never came. The hours ticked by in excruciating silence, each minute stretching out into an eternity. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped out, and I was left to bleed in the stillness of our empty home. I sent him messages. I called. Nothing. The silence from his end was worse than any argument we could have had, worse than any yelling or anger. It was like I didn't exist anymore, like he had already erased me from his life. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally pulled me under, and I fell into a restless sleep on the couch. When I woke up, the sunlight streaming through the windows only reminded me of the glaring reality I had to face. My marriage was crumbling, and it was my fault. I had never felt so lost. That morning, I found myself dialing Michael's number. It was an impulse, a desperate need to escape the crushing weight of what I had done. When he answered, his voice soft but surprised, I asked if we could meet. He hesitated for a moment, but agreed. We met in a quiet park outside of town, far away from the places Jake and I used to go. The sky was gray, matching my mood as we sat on a bench near the trees. Michael looked at me, his usual confidence replaced by concern. What happened? He asked, his hand resting lightly on my knee. I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They spilled over, and I covered my face, sobbing into my hands. I told Jake. I choked out. I told him everything. Michael didn't say anything for a moment. I could feel his eyes on me, and after what felt like an eternity, he let out a long sigh. Emily, I don't know what to do, I whispered through the tears, my voice barely audible. He's gone, Michael. I ruined everything. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried against his chest. His embrace was warm, comforting, but it wasn't enough. It didn't fill the emptiness inside me. It didn't make the guilt go away. Nothing could. You didn't ruin everything, Michael said softly, stroking my hair. You were honest with him. That's something. Maybe there's still a way to fix it. I pulled away, looking up at him, my eyes red and swollen from crying.
How?
How can I fix this? I cheated on him. I betrayed him. He's never going to forgive me. Michael didn't have an answer. He just looked at me with a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. I'm sorry, he whispered. Those words echoed in my mind as I drove home later that day.
He was sorry.
I was sorry. But what did that change? Nothing. The damage was done. Apologies wouldn't fix the broken pieces of my marriage, wouldn't erase the lies, the betrayal. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Part 7. Facing the consequences. The next few days were agonizing. Jake didn't come home, and I had no idea where he was staying. His absence gnawed at me, a constant reminder of how badly I had hurt him. I tried to reach out again, but every message went unanswered. The silence felt like a punishment, one I couldn't escape. I spent those days in a fog, going through the motions of daily life, but feeling like a ghost in my own home. Everywhere I looked, there were memories of us. Happy moments, shared laughter, quiet nights on the couch, but now they were tainted, overshadowed by the weight of what I had done. The house, once a warm and comforting place, felt like a prison. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I would lie awake at night, staring at the empty space beside me, wondering where Jake was, wondering if he'd ever come back. The guilt was unbearable, suffocating, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. On the fourth day, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed to open it, half expecting to see Jake standing there, but instead, I found his sister, Rachel, staring back at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. We hadn't seen much of each other lately, not since Jake and I had started drifting apart. I had always liked Rachel. She was sharp, outspoken, and fiercely protective of her brother. Seeing her now, I knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. She sat down on the couch, folding her arms across her chest as she looked at me. "Jake told me what happened," she said, her words cutting straight to the point. I felt my stomach drop. "Rachel, She held up a hand, stopping me. "I'm not here to yell at you or make things worse. But I need to understand. Why, Emily? Why would you do this to him?" Her question was the same one Jake had asked, and it hit just as hard the second time. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy anyone. Not Jake, not Rachel, not even myself. But I tried. "I was lonely," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "Things between us were so distant and I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I regret it more than anything." Rachel's expression softened slightly, but her eyes were still hard, still filled with disappointment. "Do you love him?" I nodded, tears filling my eyes again. "Of course I do. I've always loved him. I messed up, Rachel. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." She sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Jake's not staying with me. He's at a hotel. He doesn't know what to do, and honestly, I don't know what to tell him. He's hurt, Emily. More than I've ever seen him hurt before." I swallowed the lump in my throat, the reality of Rachel's words hitting me hard. I had destroyed the man I loved, broken something that might never be fixed. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to lose him, Rachel. I'll do anything to make it right." She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if you can make it right," she said honestly. "But if you really want to try, you need to give him space. Let him figure out what he wants. And when he's ready, if he's ready, you'll have to face the consequences of what you've done." The truth of her words cut deep. There were no easy fixes, no quick apologies that would make everything better. I had broken something precious, and now all I could do was wait and hope that it wasn't shattered beyond repair. Part 8. The silence between us. Weeks passed, and the silence between Jake and me stretched on, unbearable and heavy. I stayed in the house alone, waiting for a sign that he might be ready to talk. But nothing came. The days dragged by, each one more painful than the last, and I felt like I was unraveling. Michael tried to reach out to me a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to see him. I couldn't handle the weight of my guilt any longer. I didn't respond to his messages, didn't answer his calls. Whatever we had was over. I knew that now. It had never been real. It had been a momentary escape, a distraction from the problems I didn't want to face in my marriage. But now those problems were staring me in the face, and I had no choice but to confront them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake reached out. It was a simple message, just 5 words: "We need to talk. Tonight." My heart raced as I read the text, a mix of fear and hope swirling inside me. I didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know if he was ready to forgive me, or if this was the end. But at least it was something. At least we were finally going to talk. That evening, I sat on the couch, waiting for him. When the door opened and Jake walked in, my breath caught in my throat. He looked different, thinner, tired, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He sat down across from me, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice steady but cold.
About us.
"About what happened?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake, I'm so sorry. He held up a hand, cutting me off. Don't. I don't want to hear another apology right now. I swallowed hard, biting back the words I wanted to say. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily, he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. I loved you, he said, his voice shaking. I trusted you. And you broke that. You broke us. The pain in his voice was unbearable, and I could feel my heart shattering all over again. I never meant to hurt you, Jake. I love you. Love, he interrupted, his voice bitter. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have thrown everything we had away for him. I couldn't argue with him. He was right. What I had done was unforgivable, and there was no excuse, no explanation that could make it better. I'm not saying this is the end, Jake said after a long pause. But I need time. I need space to figure out if I can move past this. I don't know what's going to happen, Emily. But right now, I can't be with you. His words were like a punch to the gut. I had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was unbearable. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I understand. Jake stood up, his expression still hard but filled with sadness. I'll be staying with Rachel for a while. I need to think. And with that, he turned and walked out of the door, leaving me alone in the empty house once again. This time, though, I knew the silence would last longer, and I didn't know if we would ever find our way back to each other. Would you like me to continue from here?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше. Чат сказал.
Part 9. Living in Limbo. The house felt colder after Jake left, as if his absence had drained all the warmth from the walls. Every room reminded me of him, of us, before everything fell apart. The bed felt too big without him beside me. The quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. I had never felt more alone. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between Jake and me continued. I hadn't expected him to forgive me easily, but the uncertainty of our future gnawed at me. The not knowing whether he would come back, whether he even wanted to, was a weight I carried with me every day. Each morning, I'd wake up to the hollow ache of his absence, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there would be a message from him, some sign that he was ready to talk again. But there was nothing. I threw myself into work, trying to keep my mind busy. I avoided Michael at all costs, declining every meeting where I knew he would be present, keeping my distance from anyone who might ask questions. Our affair had ended the moment I told Jake the truth, but the guilt I carried with me was impossible to shake. Every time I saw Michael's name flash on my phone, I felt sick. I couldn't look at him without remembering what I had done, how I had betrayed the man I loved for a fleeting thrill, a temporary escape. I wanted to believe that it had been more than that Michael had truly meant something to me, but now it all felt hollow, like an illusion that had shattered the moment Jake walked out the door. One Friday evening, after another long, lonely week, I found myself standing in front of Jake's sister Rachel's house. I hadn't planned to go there, but something in me was desperate for answers, for some sense of direction. I needed to know if Jake was okay, if there was still hope for us. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked on the door, the uncertainty of what I might hear making my stomach twist. Rachel opened the door, surprise flashing across her face when she saw me. "Emily," she said, her tone wary but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly. I was hoping to talk to Jake. I need to know how he's doing." Rachel hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching my face. "Jake's not here," she said, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "He's staying at a friend's place for a while. He needed space, more than I could give him here." My heart sank. Even Rachel wasn't enough for him right now. "Do you know if he's okay? If he's thinking about coming back?" Rachel sighed, crossing her arms. "He's struggling, Emily. I won't lie to you. What you did, it broke him. He's angry, hurt, and he's trying to figure out if he can ever trust you again. But I think part of him still loves you. Otherwise, he wouldn't be taking this so hard. Her words gave me a small flicker of hope, but they were laced with the painful truth. Love wasn't always enough. Trust had been shattered, and that kind of damage didn't heal overnight. Is there anything I can do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to lose him, Rachel. I'll do anything. Rachel's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on my arm. Give him time, Emily. That's all you can do. If he's ready to talk, he'll reach out. But right now, he's trying to figure out if there's still a future for you too. I nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. Thank you. She gave me a small, sad smile. I'm rooting for you both. I really am. But don't push him too hard. He needs to come to his own decision. As I walked back to my car, Rachel's words echoed in my mind. Give him time. That was all I had now, time. But the more time passed, the more I feared that Jake's silence was his answer, that he wasn't coming back. Part 10. A Step Toward Healing. 3 more weeks passed before I heard from Jake again. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I saw his name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. Can we talk? I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity before typing a response. Of course. Whenever you're ready. Today came his reply. I'll come by around 2. The rest of the day was a blur of nerves and anxiety. I cleaned the house obsessively, trying to keep myself busy, trying not to think about what might happen when Jake walked through that door again. I didn't know if this conversation would be the beginning of our reconciliation or the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. At 2 o'clock sharp, there was a knock at the door. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and there he was, Jake, standing on the front porch, looking like a shadow of the man I once knew. He was thinner, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Hi, he said quietly. Hi, I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We sat down in the living room, the tension between us thick and heavy. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching out painfully. Finally, Jake broke the silence. I've been thinking about us. About everything that's happened. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I'm not going to pretend like I've figured it all out, he continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. I'm still hurt, Emily. What you did that broke me. I've been trying to understand why, trying to make sense of it, but I don't know if I ever will. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay composed. I don't have an excuse, Jake. I don't. I was selfish. I felt disconnected from you, and instead of trying to fix that, I ran. I ran to someone else because it was easier than facing what was wrong between us. And I hate myself for that. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I saw the man who had once loved me so deeply, the man I had hurt beyond repair. You should have talked to me, he said quietly. I know I wasn't perfect. I know I've been distant, but we could have worked through it together. I know, I whispered, my voice cracking.
And I'm so sorry, Jake.
I wish I could take it all back. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Emily. I don't know if we can go back to what we had. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I understand, I said, my voice trembling. I know it's going to take time. I don't expect things to be fixed overnight.
But I want to try.
I'll do anything, Jake. I don't want to lose you. He was silent for a long time, and I could see the battle going on inside him, the part of him that still loved me fighting against the part of him that was afraid to trust again. Finally, he spoke. I'm willing to try, he said slowly, his eyes meeting mine. But it's going to take time. A lot of time. And things aren't going to be the same for a long while. I need to heal, and I need to know that you're committed to fixing this. Relief flooded through me, but I kept it in check. This wasn't a victory. This was just the first step on a long road to recovery. I'm committed, I said, my voice firm despite the tears in my eyes. I'll do whatever it takes, Jake. I promise. He nodded, standing up. I'm going to stay with Rachel for a little while longer. I need space. But I'll come by. We'll talk. We'll try. It wasn't the reconciliation I had hoped for, but it was more than I had dared to expect. It was a chance, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what had been broken. Part 11. Rebuilding Trust. The days that followed were cautious, delicate steps toward healing. Jake and I spoke more frequently, though the conversations were often brief and strained. He still wasn't ready to come home, and I respected that. I knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and I was willing to wait as long as it took. We decided to see a marriage counselor, a neutral space where we could begin to unpack the layers of hurt and betrayal that had built up between us. The first few sessions were difficult, sitting across from Jake, bearing my soul in front of a stranger, confessing my deepest regrets and fears. But I could see that Jake was hurting just as much. There were moments when I thought he might walk away for good, moments when the pain seemed too much for him to bear. But each time he stayed. He was still here, still willing to try. The counselor helped us understand how we had reached this point. It wasn't just the affair. It was the years of small, unspoken resentments, the growing distance between us that neither of us had addressed. Jake admitted that he had thrown himself into work, using it as an escape from the problems in our marriage. I admitted that I had felt abandoned, left to navigate the loneliness on my own. But none of those things excused what I had done. They were just pieces of a larger puzzle that we were trying to put back together. Slowly, cautiously, we began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were days when the pain was too raw, when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under. But there were also moments of hope, small victories that reminded us why we had fallen in love in the first place. Jake started coming over for dinner a few times a week. We'd sit at the table, talking about our days, our lives, as if we were rediscovering each other all over again. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was something. It was a start. One night, after months of working on our marriage, Jake stayed over. It was the first time we had slept in the same bed since everything had fallen apart. We didn't touch, there was still a distance between us, but just having him there, knowing he was willing to stay, felt like a huge step forward. Would you like me to continue from here?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше. Чат сказал.
Part 12. Steps toward reconnection. Having Jake stay the night for the first time felt like a fragile victory. I didn't expect everything to magically fall back into place, but that night, as I lay beside him in the quiet darkness, it was the closest I had felt to him in months. We didn't speak much, both of us lost in our thoughts, but the fact that he was there, that he had chosen to be there, was enough for me. The morning after, things were still delicate. When I woke up, Jake was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and staring out the window. There was something different in his posture, something lighter, but I could still feel the weight of our shared history hanging over us. Morning, I said softly, stepping into the kitchen, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic between us. Jake glanced at me and gave a small nod. Morning. I busied myself with making breakfast, the silence between us not quite uncomfortable but far from the easy conversations we used to have. I could sense his hesitation, the way he was still holding back, and I understood. This wasn't going to be fixed with a single night together. After breakfast, Jake stood up and looked at me, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking, he began slowly, about moving back. Not permanently. Not yet. But maybe we could try living together again, just to see how things go. My heart raced at the thought, but I kept my response calm, not wanting to push him too quickly. I think that's a good idea, I said carefully. But only if you're ready. I'm not sure if I'll ever be fully ready, Jake admitted, his voice quiet. But I think I need to start somewhere. It wasn't the enthusiastic reconciliation I had once hoped for, but it was something, a tentative step forward. We agreed that he would start by staying over a few nights a week, giving us both space when we needed it. It felt like we were learning how to be together again, like we were two different people now, navigating a new relationship built on the ruins of the old one. Part 13. Learning to forgive. The next few months were a slow, sometimes painful process of rebuilding. We went to counseling sessions regularly, digging deeper into the issues that had led us to this point. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about understanding the cracks that had existed in our marriage long before that. It was about learning to communicate, to truly hear each other in ways we hadn't before. There were days when the progress felt real, tangible. We laughed together sometimes, sharing moments that reminded me of the early years of our relationship, when things were simple and full of promise. On those days, I believed that maybe we could get back to that place, or, at the very least, build something new and strong. But there were also setbacks. Sometimes Jake would withdraw, the hurt flashing in his eyes when a memory or a word would trigger thoughts of my betrayal. He tried not to bring it up all the time, tried not to dwell on it, but I knew it was always there, a shadow lurking between us. And I knew that it would take time, maybe years, for that shadow to fully fade. If it ever would. One night, after one of our better days, we sat on the couch together, the television on in the background. Jake was quiet, his eyes focused on the screen, but clearly far away in his thoughts. I knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked, his voice low but steady. My stomach tightened at the question. It wasn't the first time he had asked, but it still hit me hard every time. "No," I said honestly. "Not anymore." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been trying not to think about it, about the two of you, but sometimes it just creeps in." I reached for his hand, feeling the tension in his grip. "I understand, and I don't blame you, but I want you to know that it's over."
Completely.
"It's been over since the moment I told you the truth." He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I know. It's just hard to forget." "I don't expect you to forget," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But I'm here, Jake. I'm committed to making this work, to making up for the hurt I caused. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Jake looked at me then, his eyes soft but filled with a sadness that broke my heart all over again. "I'm trying, Emily.
I really am.
But sometimes, I just wonder if we can ever get back to what we had." I swallowed the lump in my throat, knowing that I couldn't promise him that. "Maybe we won't," I said slowly. "Maybe we won't ever be exactly like we were. But that doesn't mean we can't be something else. Something better." For a long time, he didn't respond. Then, finally, he squeezed my hand gently. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe we can." Part 14. A New Kind of Love. As the months passed, things between Jake and me slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't the kind of love we had before, there was no going back to that, but it was something different, something more cautious, but in some ways more honest. We had been through hell together, and we were still standing. That meant something. Jake moved back into the house full-time, and we started to rebuild our lives together piece by piece. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past threatened to pull us under again. But we were learning to navigate those moments, to communicate better, to lean on each other instead of pulling away. Our counselor encouraged us to find ways to reconnect outside of the pain, small things like going for walks together, cooking dinner as a team, or even just sitting down to watch a movie. It was about rediscovering the things that had once brought us joy, the things that had made us fall in love in the first place. One weekend, we decided to take a short trip to a cabin by the lake, just the two of us, away from the city and all the distractions of our daily lives. It was the first time we had really spent extended time together, just being together since everything had happened. The cabin was small and cozy, nestled in the woods with a perfect view of the water. The air was crisp, and the autumn leaves crunched underfoot as we walked along the shore, the silence between us no longer tense but peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we were going to make it through this. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, the soft crackling of the flames filling the room, Jake reached over and took my hand in his. His grip was warm, steady, and for the first time in months, it felt like there were no barriers between us. "I've been thinking a lot," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "About us. About everything we've been through." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've realized that maybe we're not supposed to go back to who we were before. Maybe that version of us is gone, and that's okay. Maybe we need to focus on building something new." Something stronger. I felt a lump form in my throat, his words echoing my own thoughts. I think you're right, I whispered. I think we've both changed, but that doesn't mean we can't be happy again. Jake turned to look at me then, his eyes soft, a hint of the old warmth I used to know so well. I'm willing to try, Emily. I'm willing to keep fighting for us. A tear slipped down my cheek, and I smiled, squeezing his hand.
Me too.
I've never stopped fighting. We sat there in the warmth of the fire, the weight of our shared past still present but no longer as heavy. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we could be okay, that we could find our way back to each other, not as the people we used to be, but as something new, something better. Part 15. The Road Ahead. The months that followed were a slow but steady journey toward healing. Jake and I continued to work on our marriage, finding new ways to reconnect and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the past threatened to creep back in, but we had learned how to face those moments together. One evening, as we sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jake turned to me and smiled, a real, genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen in a long time. You know, he said softly, I never thought we'd get to this point, but I'm glad we did. I smiled back, my heart full of a quiet, hard-earned happiness. Me too. We sat there in the fading light, side by side, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but it was one we were willing to walk together. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. Would you like to continue the story from here, or would you like to explore another idea?
Вы сказали. Продолжи как можно дальше. Чат сказал.
Part 16. Facing New Challenges. As the days passed, life began to take on a sense of normalcy again. Jake and I had carved out a new routine, one filled with the quiet, simple moments of everyday life that felt steady, even if they weren't always perfect. But even with our progress, I knew we weren't invincible. The wound from my betrayal was still there, healing but not yet a scar. It would take time, maybe a lifetime, for it to fully fade. Jake was more open now, more willing to talk about his feelings than he had ever been before. But with that openness came vulnerability, and sometimes I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The question he didn't always voice but that hung between us. Will this really last? One Saturday morning, we were sitting at the kitchen table, enjoying a rare moment of calm over breakfast. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room, and for a moment, everything felt right. Jake cleared his throat, setting down his coffee cup. There's something I've been thinking about, he said, his tone careful. I looked up from my plate, sensing the shift in his mood. What is it? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture he often made when he was anxious. I've been thinking about moving jobs, getting out of the city for a while. The suggestion caught me off guard. Moving, I repeated, my stomach tightening slightly. Where would we go? Just for a little while, he clarified, his eyes meeting mine. Maybe somewhere quieter. I've been offered a position in a smaller town about 2 hours away. It's a big step down in terms of pay, but I don't know, Emily. I think we could both use a change of scenery, a fresh start. I wasn't sure how to respond. The idea of leaving everything behind, our home, my job, the life we had painstakingly rebuilt, felt overwhelming. But at the same time, I could understand where he was coming from. The city held too many memories, both good and bad, and maybe stepping away from all of it could help us fully heal. Do you think that's what we need? I asked, my voice soft, trying to gauge his thoughts. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. I do. I think getting away from the stress, the constant reminders of everything, might help. We could focus on us, without all the noise. The idea of starting fresh sounded appealing, but it also scared me. What if leaving the city didn't fix anything? What if it made us feel more isolated, more disconnected? And yet, part of me knew that Jake needed this. He needed a break from the reminders of our past, and maybe I did too. Okay, I said slowly, nodding. If that's what you think will help, I'm willing to try. Jake reached across the table, taking my hand in his. Thank you, he said quietly. I know it's a lot to ask. I squeezed his hand gently, giving him a small smile. We'll figure out together. Part 17. The Move. The decision to move wasn't an easy one. Over the next few weeks, we started making plans, selling the house, finding a new place in the small town where Jake had been offered the job. There were moments when the enormity of the decision weighed heavily on me, but I pushed those doubts aside, focusing on the idea that this was a step toward healing, a step we needed to take. Packing up our life together was surreal. Every item we placed in a box felt like a piece of our history, some filled with joy, others with pain. There were times when I'd come across an old photo or a trinket from the early days of our relationship, and the memories would hit me like a wave, bittersweet reminders of how far we'd come and how much we had lost along the way. Jake was quiet during those days, methodically packing up his things, his face unreadable. I knew he was processing everything in his own way, just as I was. The move felt symbolic, like we were closing one chapter of our lives and opening another. The new town was small, quaint even, with quiet streets and a slower pace of life than we were used to. Our new home was modest, nothing like the spacious house we had left behind, but it had a warmth to it, a feeling that maybe this was where we could rebuild, where we could start again. Our first night in the new house was a strange mix of emotions. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, eating takeout in the dim light of a single lamp we had managed to unpack. There was something almost comforting in the simplicity of it, like we were stripping everything down to the basics. Jake looked around the room, then at me. Do you think this will work? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, I admitted honestly. But I think it's worth trying. He nodded, his expression thoughtful.
Yeah.
Me too. Part 18. Rediscovering each other. The first few months in the new town were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. Jake's new job demanded a lot of his time, and with fewer distractions, we were forced to face each other in ways we hadn't before. There were no more work excuses, no more city distractions. It was just us. At first, it was tense. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, both of us afraid to reopen old wounds. But as the days passed, something shifted. We began to settle into a new routine, simpler, quieter. We took walks together in the evenings, exploring the quiet streets of the town, talking about everything and nothing. There was a new intimacy in these moments, a kind of quiet understanding that didn't need words. We were learning to be with each other again, without the weight of the past constantly looming over us. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were making progress, slowly but surely. One weekend, we decided to drive out to a nearby lake, a place that had been recommended by a neighbor. The drive was peaceful, the winding roads lined with trees bursting with fall colors. It was the kind of serene beauty that felt like a world away from the chaos of our old life. As we walked along the edge of the lake, the air crisp and cool, Jake turned to me, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Do you remember the first trip we took together? He asked. I smiled, nodding. How could I forget? That disastrous camping trip where we forgot half our supplies. Jake laughed, the sound warm and genuine.
Yeah.
And we ended up eating nothing but granola bars and instant noodles for 2 days. Not our finest moment, I said with a grin. But it was still one of my favorite memories, Jake said, his eyes softening. Because it was just us. No expectations, no pressure. Just being together. I looked at him, feeling a swell of emotion. I miss that, I admitted. I miss the way we used to be. Me too, he said quietly. But I think maybe we can get back there. Or at least find something close to it. There was hope in his voice, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. We had been through so much, pain, betrayal, doubt, but standing there by the lake, I realized that we were still here, still trying. And maybe that was enough. Part 19, New Beginnings. As the months continued to pass, Jake and I found a new rhythm, one that felt more natural, more grounded. We were no longer the people we had been before, and we both knew that. But in a way, that was okay. We were learning to love each other in new ways, accepting the imperfections in ourselves and in our relationship. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the past would creep back in, casting shadows over our progress. But those moments were fewer now, and when they did come, we faced them together, instead of retreating into our own separate worlds. The town became our home in a way I hadn't expected. The slower pace of life gave us the space we needed to heal, to focus on what truly mattered. We made friends with our neighbors, got involved in the community, and slowly, the sense of isolation we had felt after the move began to fade. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the horizon, Jake reached for my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. There was a peace in that moment, a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I think we're going to be okay," Jake said softly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. I looked at him, my heart full. "I think so too." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I truly believed it. Part 20. The Future Ahead. As the years went by, the pain of the past slowly faded, replaced by the new life Jake and I had built together. It wasn't a perfect story, and it wasn't the life we had once envisioned, but it was real. It was ours. We had learned how to forgive, how to rebuild, and most importantly, how to love each other through the messiness of life. The affair, the betrayal, the hurt, it would always be a part of our story, but it didn't define us anymore. We had moved beyond it, together. One afternoon, as we sat together.
Вы сказали. Заканчивай.
Чат сказал. Conclusion. A life rebuilt. One afternoon, as we sat together on the porch of our small, quiet home, I realized how far we had come. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields beyond our yard, and the air was filled with the soft sounds of the evening, a peaceful stillness that had become familiar and comforting. Jake was beside me, his hand resting on mine, and for the first time in years, there was no tension between us. No unspoken words, no lingering shadows of the past. We were simply there, together, and that was enough. The road to this moment had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and heartbreak. But it was also filled with growth, with forgiveness, and with a kind of love that had been tested and proven stronger than I ever thought possible. It wasn't the love we had started with. It was something deeper, more resilient. We had faced our darkest moments and come out the other side, not unscathed but stronger for it. I turned to Jake, a soft smile playing on my lips. "Do you think we're finally okay?" I asked, my voice light but filled with sincerity. Jake looked at me, his eyes warm and filled with the quiet wisdom that only time and experience could bring. He smiled, squeezing my hand gently. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." In that moment, I knew that we had truly rebuilt our life together. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, and it was ours. And that was more than enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft twilight, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The past was behind us, and the future, though uncertain, was something we would face together. And that was all I needed.